between each group. Hi, and welcome back for part 2 of the Introduction to Biology unit of notes. We're now going to start talking about classification, how we classify organisms into different groups. And the science of grouping organisms is known as taxonomy. The first system of grouping organisms was developed by Aristotle, and it only consisted of 2 groups, plants and animals. So if they were going to classify a certain organism and it looked more like a plant, acted more like a plant, they would put it in the plant group. If it looked more like an animal, they would put it in the animal group. Today, however, we know that there are various ways to group organisms into additional categories based on structure, but also based on DNA analysis. So we're going to take a look at some of those groups today. In the 1750s, Carl von Linné developed the first comprehensive classification system for plants and animals, and he began to assign organisms a 2-word name. And so binomial nomenclature literally means 2 names, is a naming system that requires the designation of 2 names to every organism. The first part of that name is called the genus, and then the second part of that name is called a species. So you're probably familiar with the scientific name of a human, which is Homo sapien. The word homo is the genus name, and the word sapien would represent the species name. Now, a lot of these names are going to sound kind of funny to us because they're based on Latin. And so a lot of them, things like Quercus alba and Felis domesticus and things like that use the Latin language, and it sounds a little funny to us. And so Carl von Linné's friends in the scientific community actually gave him a nickname that kind of sounds like a Latin name, and that was Carolus Linnaeus. And a lot of times he's better known as Linnaeus now than as Linné. So these are one and the same people. It's just a kind of a nickname that he was given. So the common name that we give to an organism is what we call it in everyday language. So, dog, cat, and then the scientific name is that binomial name given to the species that contains both a genus and a species name. So another example for common name dog, the scientific name would be Canis familiaris. So Canis is the genus name and familiaris is the species name. Also notice how that word is written. Right here, Canis familiaris, the first word Canis is capitalized, but the second word familiaris is lowercase. This is the correct way to write a scientific name. Genus name will always be capitalized, species name will always be lowercase. Also, if we are typing this word, these words, then typically we do that in italics. And if you're handwriting it, then you would want to underline it. So you want to make sure that you understand the correct way to write a scientific name. That is genus name capitalized, species name lowercase, and it should be either italicized or underlined. Here's another example, the common name tiger. The scientific name is Panthera tigris. Panthera is genus, tigris is species, and you can see there that it is written correctly. Now we can look at the order of classification. When we talk about classifying organisms, we start with some very broad categories. And this one is known as domain, is the broadest of these categories. There are actually only 3 domains, and we'll talk about these a little bit later. And those domains are divided up into groups called kingdoms, and then those kingdoms are divided up into groups called phyla, or singular is phylum. A phylum is made up of groups called classes. A class is made up of groups called orders. Orders are made of families. Families are made of genera, which is the plural for genus, and then genera are made up of species. So if we could think about this as sort of an upside down triangle, then we would see that domain, this is very broad category. You can't say, hey, that organism that's in domain eukarya, you know which one I'm talking about? No, because there are so many in that. But if I tell you I'm talking about a Homo sapien, then species is very specific. So domain's a broad category, and it gets more specific as we go down. An example of this, we'll use the classification of a human. The human is in domain eukarya, and that just means it's made of eukaryotic cells that have nuclei. We'll learn all about that later. It is in kingdom Animalia. It is in the phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, and species Sapien. So that's just an example of how an organism would be classified according to these taxonomic levels. Now, it is important that you remember these taxonomic levels in order from broadest to most specific. So I have a mnemonic here to help you remember that. It's did Ken pour Coke on Fred's good shirt? And of course that represents domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, one year I was teaching high school biology 2, and I was going through the classification scheme, and they kind of made fun of my sentence, which is the one that I learned in school, so I guess it is pretty old. And so they came up with their own, and I'm going to let you in on that one as well in case you like it a little better. It is, do kids playing catch on freeways get squashed? So whichever one of those you like the best, use it to remember the order of classification. Again, in order from broadest to most specific. Okay, again, I said there were 3 domains, and the 3-domain classification system was developed by Carl Woese in 1990. And it is sometimes also referred to as the 6-kingdom system because there are 3 domains and there are now 6 kingdoms. The first domain that we'll look at is eukarya. These are made up of eukaryotic cells, so that's where it gets its name. Eu means true, and kary refers to a nucleus, so this is a true nucleus cell. They also have membrane-bound organelles, so we're going to see things like mitochondria, we're going to see Golgi apparatus, we're going to see endoplasmic reticulum, and this includes all plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So this is a pretty big domain, pretty diverse domain for all of those organisms. The other 2 domains, however, are both made of what we call prokaryotic cells. And prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and they're not going to have those more complex organelles like mitochondria and Golgi. Both of these, again, are made of cells with no nuclei, but there's a little bit of a difference in where they reside and what kind of environment they can survive in. Archaeans can survive in very hostile environments, so they can live in areas that have very extreme temperatures, so hot temperatures like the hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. They can live in areas that have a high salt content, so like very salty oceans. And then they can also live in areas of acidic pHs, so really hostile environments, really extreme environments for the archaeans. And then the last domain, bacteria, is again prokaryotic cells, but these are the ones that we would think about when we talk about bacteria. These are the ones that we think about making us sick. These are the ones that live in your intestines that are beneficial to help you digest your food, break down your food. So these are the ones that are in common everyday human life. They don't live in those hostile environments. They couldn't survive there. So those 3 domains, eukarya, archaea, and bacteria, are the broadest of the taxonomic levels. Now, we can divide those the domains into 6 kingdoms. Okay, so we have 3 domains, and it's domain and then kingdom, and we'd have 6 kingdoms. So archaea bacteria, that's going to be a kingdom of the archaeans. Eubacteria, that's going to be the kingdom of the bacteria domain. And then these other 4 are going to be the ones that we would divide eukarya into. So domain eukarya is made up of 4 kingdoms. We have Protista, and if you look on the right side of this slide, we have some protists here. These are mostly known as aquatic organisms. They're microscopic. Most of them are unicellular. Things like paramecium, euglena, amoeba, all of those are going to be the protists. Then we have fungi. You're probably familiar with mushrooms as fungi. And then in this picture here, this is a unicellular fungus known as yeast. So yeast that is used to make bread and so forth. So fungi would be made up of eukaryotic cells, so they are in domain eukarya. And then 5th and 6th, plants and animals. So protists, fungi, plants, and animals all make up domain eukarya. And then with archaeobacteria and eubacteria, that makes up those 6 kingdoms. The last thing that I want to talk about in this unit is the endosymbiotic theory. Now, most scientists believe that the first cell must have been anaerobic, heterotrophic, and prokaryotic. So let's talk about what that means. We just talked about prokaryotes. We know that those are made up of cells that do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. Their DNA is just floating around in the cytoplasm. And they also do not have membrane-bound organelles like Golgi and mitochondria. They are heterotrophic. Remember, we talked about heterotrophs in the first part of this unit. So these are consumers. These are organisms that can't make their own food. And then that other word, anaerobic, actually means without oxygen. So aerobic would refer to a process that has to have oxygen, and then anaerobic is one that can take place without oxygen. So most scientists believe that the first cell must have been one that could survive without oxygen, had to consume its nutrients, and was made up of cells that did not have a nucleus. Also, it is important to note that the atmosphere of the early Earth was believed to not contain oxygen. So, any organism that lived there obviously had to be anaerobic. Now, scientists believe that these cells eventually evolved the ability to create their own food by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, using products from their environment, and to become autotrophic. And so let's say that they were going through photosynthesis. One of the byproducts of photosynthesis is oxygen. So, plants go through photosynthesis, they produce oxygen, and we breathe that in. So if a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, then what was happening was that as these organisms were undergoing photosynthesis, they were then putting oxygen into the atmosphere. So the oxygen in the atmosphere allowed the anaerobic prokaryotes to evolve into aerobic cells. Now, again, this is a theory that is pretty widely accepted in the scientific community and is supposed to describe their thoughts on how eukaryotic cells formed. So first, it explains the origin of mitochondria. Now, it's important to know that mitochondria is the organelle that is responsible for aerobic respiration. So there's that word aerobic, which means requires oxygen, right? So it states that a large anaerobic cell engulfed one of those aerobic cells, and they formed a symbiotic relationship, and ultimately it is believed that the aerobic prokaryote developed into the mitochondrion. This symbiotic relationship is thought to have resulted in the first aerobic eukaryote. Okay, so it engulfed an aerobic prokaryotic cell to become an aerobic eukaryote because, at that point it would have had an organelle. All other heterotrophic eukaryotic cells would have evolved from these and to include animal cells, fungi, and the heterotrophic protists. Secondly, according to the endosymbiotic theory, an aerobic eukaryote that was just developed may have engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium, one of those bacterial cells that we talked about in the beginning that was capable of photosynthesis, to form other symbiotic relationships, and that would have developed into a chloroplast. We know chloroplasts are the cells that, are the organelles that undergo photosynthesis. So according to this theory, the new photosynthetic autotrophic, then, eukaryotic cell would be an ancestor for plant cells and autotrophic protist cells. This diagram may make that make a little bit more sense to you. According to this theory, the cell in the beginning consumed an aerobic bacterium that evolved into mitochondria, and then it consumed a photosynthetic bacterium that evolved into the chloroplast. And again, scientists believe that this is how the cell developed from an anaerobic, heterotrophic, prokaryotic cell to an aerobic, autotrophic, eukaryotic cell. So again, that's the endosymbiotic theory, and this concludes our notes for the Introduction to Biology unit.